It's exciting to know that there are organizations and individuals who've been fighting this battle and understand this history, understand what's been happening. And as a mom in Texas who, because of the tenacity of Ginger Russell and her mother, and Donna Garner, who I want to thank for all the incredible information and knowledge that you have shared with moms like me. Because we have a conference call on Wednesday night, and if we didn't have those conference calls, I would not have been able to connect the dots and start to clearly understand what this big picture is and the illusions that have been created that caused me to send my children to school thinking that those teachers love my kids. Of course they're getting a good education. And then, because of technology and the great work that Dr. Peg Luksik has been doing for so many years, I watched a 2-hour video and was just going, okay, I get it now. I'm connecting the dots. C-scope is Common Core. It's all connected. And so when Rebecca had this crazy idea of having this counter conference, and I am blaming it on her, and you'll get to meet her a little bit later. I called Peg Luksik, I called Dr. Sandra Stotsky. They said they would be here, when and where, and we will be there. And I said, okay, we're having a counter convention, let's go. And so I want to, and I'm not going to take the time to do a big introduction. I'm going to let you tell us who you are and how you got there, and the battle that we fought, that you fought, along with so many others, to push back. Now it's our turn to fight. So, Dr. Peg Luksik.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming today. I come from the state of Pennsylvania. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. The first thing you need to know is that my 35th wedding anniversary is Monday. And my husband and I have 6 children. They are all girls except for 5 of them. It's an IQ joke. How fast did you get it? My background, I am a teacher. I have in both special ed and elementary education. I've taught everything from preschool through college in pretty much every educational setting. While I was in grad school, part of my fellowship requirements was to run the psychometric testing clinic at the university. So I have a great deal of experience in administering, interpreting, scoring, and then diagnosing children based on those tests. For a number of years, I worked for the United States Department of Education. My job was to review and evaluate education reform initiatives. I was also an advisor to the Reagan administration's Commission on the Family. I was about 6 years old when I did that, just so you understand. Before I forget, I always get asked, can we get copies of things you've done? And so one of my sons is an engineer, and he helped me produce. They're in the back. When I go to a state, I always look at the state documents. I have with me today Pennsylvania and New York because they're the last 2 I've done. There's also one called Should Our Children Be Standardized that actually goes into what happens when you create one standard for everyone. And they'll be in the back at the end if you would like to participate. Here you are. If I don't say it at the beginning, I forget at the end. I do have a long history in this because I was one of the opponents of outcome-based education. I actually debated it in every state but Hawaii. I was even in Alaska. Now, I went to North Dakota in February and Louisiana in August, which my husband said was poor planning on my part. But I wound up debating secretaries of education and governor's assistants and pretty much the teachers' unions and the school superintendents on this reform. How did I get involved? Pennsylvania was one of the states when Goals 2000 was being implemented, and we published what were called outcomes. There were hundreds of them. And I got a copy and thought, I don't really want to do this. I'm very busy. And someone called and said, they're 30 days away from being enacted. Could you please help? So I read them. The child will respond appropriately to various forms of humor. The child will appreciate alternative lifestyles. The child will demonstrate honesty. So I thought these are insane. So I called the State Board of Education and I got the executive director and I said, where did you get these? And he said, oh, well, we had meetings all over the state of Pennsylvania, and parents and teachers and taxpayers all came together and they wrote these. And I said, uh-huh. So when they came to the meeting, was there a table in the room? Well, of course. Was the table empty? Well, no. What was on the table? Connecticut's outcomes. Okay, thank you very much. I called Connecticut. And we went through the same thing. And where did you get your outcomes? Pennsylvania. Something's rotten in the state of Denmark. As I traveled from state to state, at one point I stood in Ohio and read them Colorado's outcomes, except they were holding Ohio's and they thought I was reading Ohio's. They were identical. Now, if they said times tables, I wouldn't have minded so much. But appreciate humor? So I started to do press conferences and to kind of build some public awareness. And in one of them, we walked through the we'll be tolerant of various lifestyles. And the press went, what's the matter with that? And I said, I'm a cannibal. It's my lifestyle. Appreciate me. That wasn't what they expected. I'm a hitman. I'm a drug dealer. I'm a pedophile. Those are my lifestyles. All of a sudden, it didn't mean what they thought it meant. And so things started to turn. The battle took years. In that battle, I did a video called Who Controls the Children that literally went from coast to coast. No, I'm afraid not. Is it going to continue? There we go. Haha. Literally went from coast to coast, and I wrote a book called Outcome-Based Education, The State's Assault on Our Children's Values that went through 2 editions. And it went, again, from coast to coast. And parents and teachers and taxpayers stood up and fought back. And here we are again. And when I started Common Core, I looked at Who Controls the Children, which I made in the early 1990s, and realized you could be talking about the same thing, because there is no difference. This is just the latest iteration of the federal government attempting to standardize our children. So let's take a minute and walk through the theory underneath. Because what you hear is, well, we're probably just not implementing that correctly. It's broken at its root. There's no way to correctly administer poison if it's poison that you're administering. So let's talk about how this fits together. We're going to have achievement standards, and as you heard, No Child Left Behind said by the end of this school year that just ended, 100% of the children had to be proficient in math and reading and science. That means meet the bar. Can you mandate achievement? Well, you can. Does that mean it will happen? So when you mandate an impossibility, what occurs? Let me show you. Stand up. Wiggle your little tushies while you're up there. Exercise is good. Okay, this is vocal performance. When you can meet the standard, you can sit down, but you cannot sit down until you meet the standard. Are you ready? Luciano Pavarotti. Anybody who can sing like Pavarotti can sit down. Soloist with the New York Metropolitan Opera. Chorus member with the New York Metropolitan Opera. Soloist with a regional symphony. Chorus member with a regional symphony. Soloist with the church choir. Sings in the church choir. Sings in the shower and enjoys it. Can't carry a tune in a bucket. Can't find the bucket. Now, every state is mandated to say 100% of the children will be proficient. But the state could set the definition of proficient wherever it wanted. Where was it going to set the definition for proficient in vocal performance? Well, where did you all sit down? At Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. I'm a teacher in a classroom. I have punishments if all of the children in my classroom do not reach my standard. There is no reward for anybody getting beyond my standard. So if the state sets the standard, it Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It, and the teacher is punished if every child does not reach Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It, where is that teacher going to spend his or her time? With the can't find the buckets out there. Getting them up to Sings in the Shower and Enjoys It. But what about the child for whom the standard should have been Pavarotti? Well, education failed that child. But it was a silent failure. because that child could sing in the shower and enjoy it before that kid even entered the classroom. So they met the standard. No one knew that education failed that child, but it did. Now, in vocal performance, it's kind of an amusing anecdote unless you actually happen to be a child who is going to be a vocal performer. But what about if it's math or reading? This system changes the way that we look at education, and it changes the way that we look at our children. It used to be that the goal of education was to take that child and bring that child to his or her potential. But in this system, the goal of education is to meet the standard. The standard is the goal. And if the standard is low, you met the goal. Well, is it low everywhere else? When the Common Core standards were being developed, William McCallum, one of the developers, actually attended a conference of math educators, and they didn't like the standards. They complained a lot. And he said, among other things, don't worry because the overall standards won't be too high. Trevor Packer, who's the senior vice president of the College Board, spoke to the American Association of School Superintendents, and he said, calculus sits outside the Common Core standards. Common Core asks educators to slow the math progression down. The National Center for Education and the Economy published a document called Tough Choices or Tough Times. It was published in May of 2013. The document was called What Does It Actually Mean to Be College and Work Ready? Published in May of 2013. And they walked through what do we mean by these rigorous standards. And what they said was being able to do the very beginning classes in a community college. They went on to define that as more time on middle school math, Algebra 1 by the end of your sophomore year in high school. Because, they said, most community colleges begin with Algebra 1, so you don't need to have Algebra 2 in high school to take Algebra 1 in college. Nobody would do that. I come from the state of Pennsylvania. In the state of Pennsylvania, under Common Core, the high school math graduation requirement is Algebra 1. The test is called the Keystone Test, and the only one in math you have to pass to graduate is the Algebra 1 Keystone, and you do not have to pass it until the 11th grade. Because you remember Algebra 1 by the end of your sophomore year in high school. In September of last year, there was a debate, and there were 3 on the con side, 3 on the pro side, including the secretary, and one of the folks on the proponent side said to me, Peg, these are still high standards. They can still take AP Algebra 2. And I waited to see if anybody would correct him, but nobody did. Well, currently, if you take Algebra 2 in college, it's not an AP course. It's a remedial course. But if you don't have to take Algebra 1 until your sophomore year, that makes geometry your junior year, and that makes Algebra 2 your senior year. Now, the document, what does it really mean to be college and work ready, said that they were based on research. So I looked. The U.S. Department of Education actually does do research. In 1999, they published a document called Answers in the Toolbox, where they looked at what factors led to success in college. And what they found was that if a child had any high school math beyond Algebra 2, they more than doubled their chances of getting a bachelor's degree if they went to college. That study became the basis of a meta-analysis done in 2004 by Auburn University. They looked at 25 years worth of studies, and what they found was that if a child gets to calculus in high school, they are 28 times more likely not just to get a college degree, but to be a high achiever in post-secondary school. And that was corrected for race, socioeconomic status, and the kind of high school you went to. So in other words, the highest level of math you get in high school is the biggest predictor of success in college, and if you can get past Algebra 2, you will succeed. And if you get to calculus, you're almost guaranteed to succeed. Now, am I saying every child should take calculus? No. Am I saying every child should go to college? No. What I am saying is that no high school policy should deny our children the opportunity to have the coursework that opens doors of achievement for them in college. And Common Core closes doors that the U.S. Department of Education absolutely knew needed to be opened. Isn't it funny that they didn't know in 2014 what they did know in 1999? Now, what happens in a classroom? Because what you hear is, these are just standards. This isn't curriculum. These are just standards. That is educational poppycock. Let me give you an example. The standard is, you have to, here's my chocolate cake. Your chocolate cake has to taste just like my chocolate cake and have the same texture as my chocolate cake. You see my cake? It's a really good cake. And the assessment is, I'm coming to taste your cake. How many recipes can there be? One. Because if you change anything in the recipe, it won't taste like mine, or it won't have the same texture as mine. And then if the Department of Education says, and you know what, on our website, we're going to put the recipe for all of you people, and you can have it for free if you just go there. Won't you go there? Of course you will. Did they know that? Oh, absolutely, they did. The U.S. Department of Education actually had training sessions when they began the money from the Obama administration, and they talked about in the training sessions, well, if the standards are federally controlled and the assessments are federally controlled, and even if your state does not use PARCC or the Smarter Balance, every state had to submit their state assessments to the federal government for approval to be used. So if I control the standard and I control the assessment, of course I control the curriculum. And the handout that they gave every state said standards assessment aligned instruction. Because everybody knows that standards that don't have curriculum attached are meaningless. They're not worth the paper that they're written on. So this has been about control from the beginning. Now we talked a little bit about the math rigor, slowing math down. What about English? Well, if you read what the marketing says, it says close and thoughtful reading of the text. So I went out and bought the 12th grade literature book published by Pearson, which is the largest publishing house producing all the Common Core materials. It was their 12th grade literature book, and I started paging through it and thought, wow, there's Chaucer in here, and there's Beowulf in here, and okay. And so I thought, well, I'll read through the whole thing. So I opened it up, and here's page 1 of the student book. And on the very first page of the student book, the first thing that they tell the students is, every selection in this book is available in audio format. In other words, you don't have to read a single word. And the second thing that they tell them in the same little box is that we give you audio summaries of every selection. So you don't even have to read the Cliff Notes, because we'll give you the Cliff Notes version that you can listen to. I'm wondering how it can be close and thoughtful reading of the text if you don't have to even read the text at all. And that's the first thing that we tell the children. Now, I've been in lots of classrooms, and if you're honest, you'll know you probably did this too. We all know kids read the Cliff Notes, or now they call them the Sparks Notes. We all knew that they did that. You probably did too. If you're really honest, you probably did too. But those of us teachers who actually wanted them to read the language of Shakespeare or Chaucer, we made sure that our tests and our activities, you couldn't actually do them if you only read the cheat sheet. We wanted you to read the real thing. But in this case, the publisher says you don't have to read anything, you can listen to it, and we'll give you a audio Cliff Notes. And of course, all of the activities and all of the tests, we're writing those too, so those Cliff Notes will work. Doesn't sound rigorous to me, does it? Now, the base of this is the test. All these kids have to pass a state assessment. And what we hear is, and what you've seen is, these tests are valid and reliable. Now, valid and reliable actually does mean something. It's a construct in evaluation. The first thing for a test to be valid and reliable is that the person doing the testing can have no connection to the person doing the implementing. Can you imagine if a doctor stood up and said, I have a cure for every kind of cancer that there is, and I have tested my program, and I know that it works, and now I'm going to put it on the market and make sure every cancer patient has to have it? Would anybody buy that? Then why are we buying that the same State Department of Education that is handing us the standards and putting together the curriculum is writing the test, scoring the test, and then reporting on its own results? If you were a bank, would you give a business a loan based on that kind of information? No, of course not. And what does it look like when they write the test, score the test, and report on their own results? Well, in Maryland, their website actually says that the teachers got together and put the definition of proficient where all the kids would meet it. And it says it in those words. In Pennsylvania, the Algebra 1 test, there were 2 sections, and each section had 3 little subsections. In the very first subsection, there were 9 possible points. If you got 3 of them, you passed. That's a 33%. The highest percentage you needed to get was a 60%. Now, parents didn't know that that was what it meant. Parents got a paper saying, congratulations, little Johnny is proficient. Trust me, no teacher anywhere and no parent anywhere getting a test paper that had a score between 33 and 60 would say, congratulations, you're proficient. Those would not be the words we would be using. But yet, the Pennsylvania test said that was what proficient meant. And what they did was you didn't get a raw score, the actual score. You got a scale score, meaning we assign an arbitrary artificial number. And what the parents were told was the scale score means the same from year to year. Yeah, but what does it mean? Well, they didn't tell you that part. If you're only getting 33% of Algebra 1, there's no way on the planet you can do any higher math than that. Sadly, only 34% of the kids made it, even with that definition. In Georgia, the teachers got together to define proficient, and so I read through their process, and they gave them the test, and the teachers took the test, and they decided, okay, these are the things we think that all the children need to pass. Then they were given information saying, if you put the standard there, this is how many children will pass. Would you like to move the standard? And they went through that process 3 times. Each time being told, if you put it there, this is how many will pass. In Tennessee, they reported that 100% of their children were proficient on the state assessment. When those same children in the same grade took the national assessment in the same subject area, 26% passed. How could that possibly happen? Because the states were told, you have to prove that 100% of your children are proficient, or there are penalties, but you can set proficient wherever you want. So what did they do? Well, they set proficient as low as they could. When you're mandated to accomplish an impossibility, you maneuver to make it look like you did so. And that's what the states did. And they all did it. All the states lowered the definition for proficient. The Common Core marketer stepped in and said, nobody's proficient, nobody's matching. So we're not going to address the fact that we've mandated an impossibility. We're not going to look at, can you actually make every child achieve the same knowledge to the same level? Instead, we're just going to centralize control. So Common Core took a failed program, did not address any of the reasons that it failed. Instead, they just centralized it. So you have even less control. And the same states are internally auditing themselves. Now let's look at the assessments. When you went to school, you took achievement tests, you probably remember. You either took the California or the Metropolitan or the Iowa or the Stanford. They were the 4 big boys, so you probably took one of those. Achievement tests were not high stakes for you. It was like they took your temperature. This is how you do. And what you got back from that achievement test, when you got the score sheet, it said, your little Johnny scored at the 75th percentile compared to all the children in the nation, meaning 75% of the kids were worse and 25 were better. And he scored at the 80th percentile based on your state. You got little Johnny's operating at this grade level. How did they know? Because achievement tests, let's say it was 4th grade, the questions went from 1st grade to almost 8th grade. It was usually a 3.5 year spread on each side. And so when they scored the test, they could say, oh, he answered all the questions correctly to here, but here's where he stopped. So we know just where understanding stopped, which is how they got the grade level. Or he's answered everything correctly, so he's operating this many grades ahead. And if you remember, it would say, like if you were in 4th grade, it would say 8+ or 7+, meaning that's as far as the test went. And you answered them all correctly. So we don't really know how much farther little Johnny could have gone. So you got a grade level. You got a raw score on that paper. It said there were 10 questions and you got 6 correct. And so the 4 you didn't, on the side it would say that you didn't do the multiplication. You got question 7 wrong. It was about multiplication. So you knew how your child compared. You knew about what grade level he was operating on. You knew what his raw score was. And you knew which ones of these did he not understand. So the teacher had something to work with. Teachers were evaluated using achievement tests, saying, okay, if this is 4th grade and the middle of your class is at 4th grade, you're doing a good job. There's going to be kids above and kids below. We used to call that the bell curve. A bell curve looks like a snake that swallowed an elephant. It's skinny on the ends and fat in the middle. Teachers, therefore, because the achievement test measured all the way up and down, if the middle was the middle, teachers were rewarded for pushing the kids at the top as hard as they could to pull the top of the curve up, and then they pulled the kids at the bottom. And as long as their middle was the middle, they're doing a good job, because there was an understanding that children aren't identical. They're not the same. If you look at your lap, pretend there's a string on your lap. In traditional education, the teacher pulled the string across the lap. Right beside the teacher's fingers is the top of the string. Those are the kids who learned it almost before you taught it. And at the bottom were the kids who learned it the most slowly, but they kept moving forward because education spiraled around. But in this system, the teacher's going to go to the other end and push the string because the top doesn't have to move. Totally different image. So, but in Common Core tests, they don't work like that. First of all, they're high stakes. Can you give a high stakes assessment to children and make it be valid? No, you cannot. Because you cannot control what the children bring to the testing situation. Maybe their dog died last night. Maybe they're sick and don't know it. Maybe there was an ambulance up the street. Or there was a huge upheaval in their family that they're now upset, and so they're not really focusing. In any given large testing population, about 10% of the kids will have that extraneous factor that is affecting their score. But you don't know which 10% they are. However, as the socioeconomic status of the children drops, that percentage rises. Because they're more likely not to have had breakfast that morning, and they're more likely to have had family upheaval or something happening in the neighborhood that kept them awake the night before. So for the children that you most need valid results for, you are the least likely to get them. But you don't know which children they are. So the Common Core tests on their face are not meeting the status for valid. Now let's look inside the test. The Park test says starting in 6th grade they can use a calculator. Many states let them use a calculator at any level. Some states say not only can you use a calculator, but we're going to give you the formulas that you'll need to solve the problems that we ask you. So they hand the kids a formula sheet, and then they can use a calculator. That's a plug and chug test. All they have to be able to do is plug the numbers in. What about the children who don't have a calculator? The Park tests say they can use a word processor, which includes spell check. So they don't have to be able to spell either. The math tests include what is called a constructed response now. That's where you get a math problem that comes in parts. It's worth 4 to 6 points. The first part is math, they do it. The second part is math, they do it. Third part is math, they do it. Fourth part, write about why you solved the problem the way that you solved it. Is that a math test or a writing test? That's a writing test, but we call it math. Who will do poorly on that section? Boys. When you ask a little girl to write an essay, you get 3 pages and little hearts over the eyes, and she'll probably tell you what she had for breakfast that morning while she's explaining it. You ask boys, especially boys who are really good at math, why did you do the math the way you did the math? They'll write because that's the way it works. And what they're thinking, but usually are polite enough not to write, is you dummy. Why did you ask me that? I did the math. Who else? ESL kids, for whom English is a problem. Learning disabled kids, who often in learning disabilities, Nobody exactly knows why, but they often do better in math than they do in language. So these kids might have done the math correctly, but might not be able to explain to you why it happened, particularly autistic kids. That's a big thing. Kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, because standard English isn't always spoken in their home. But are they going to get a lower writing score? No, they're going to get a lower math score, which means they'll be placed in math remediation. So Common Core slows the math progression down, and kids who get low math scores are put in math remediation, so we slow the progression down one more time, even though it may not be a math problem. But what is the key to college success? Math. And this system doubly denies kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. You know, we use the word discrimination a lot when we shouldn't. This is discriminatory. This actually is discriminatory. Well, remediation, what happens? New York City schools in 2010, when the kids all did poorly on the test, they changed their curriculum to say 2.5 hours a day of remediation. Where did that 2.5 hours come from? Had to come from somewhere. It came from music and art and computer science and maybe an extra history course or English course. Kids who never needed remediation before are all of a sudden finding themselves in remedial courses because, for example, in New York, their pass rate went from 60-some% to 37%, which was predicted before the test was even written. What a surprise. And so all of these children now need to be in remedial courses to get to these minimum standards. Well, what does that look like if you're actually a child? I told you I have 6 children. We're going to use 3 of them as an example. My oldest son is a licensed architect. He's tone deaf. He was the one that if he was singing in the shower, everyone else in the family pounded on the door and said, please stop, because it sounds so awful. I have one daughter. She is a classical ballerina. She is the principal dancer at Madison Ballet. She's been a professional dancer now for more than a decade. We homeschooled her for high school so that she could dance. She is the mathematical equivalent of a dyslexic. She brought me a time problem once with a negative answer, and I said, honey, that can't be right. And she said, why? I said, time doesn't go backwards. And she looked at me like I was from Mars, and I said, can you get younger? I don't know. Okay, so math is not her thing, to put it mildly. My 4th child, 3rd son, is an opera singer. When he was in college, he decided it would enhance his career if he took dance. At the end of a couple of semesters, the professor came to him and said, well, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news, you're the hardest working child in this room, and you are the most improved student that I have. The bad news, you've gone from horrendous to abysmal. Please never take another dance class again. I'll give you an A so I don't mess up your GPA if you promise me you won't ever come here again. And he was laughing when he told me. Okay, so this is Common Core, and we have to be remediated to get to these minimum standards. So where do we get the time? Well, my architect son would need to be remediated to get from can't find the bucket to sings in the shower and enjoys it. And the time would have to come from design and math, because that's where he's way above the standard, so we take the time from that. And my dancing daughter would have to be remediated in math to figure out the time doesn't go backwards. Where do we get the time? From dance. And my opera singer son would need to be remediated to be able to do one pirouette without falling on his face. Where would we get the time? From vocal performance. I thought education was supposed to be about building each child to their potential. But that's not what Common Core is about, because in Common Core you spend all your time remediating your weakness to minimum competency instead of developing your strength to maximum potential. I've trained teachers when I was in, when you're in grad school and you have a fellowship, you're like slave labor, so anything they need to be done, you kind of have to do. When I was in grad school, that was when the federal Public Law 94-142, that was the special ed law that created IEPs, was passed. And so there were like 6 of us, we were the regional trainers for the entire northwest quadrant of the state of Pennsylvania in how to implement this law and how to train teachers to be able to deal with least restrictive environment. And then since then, I've both trained teachers in classroom management and how to teach. So I've spent an awful lot of time in training teachers in my whole career. And one of the things that I used to say, until I was kind of tired of hearing me say it, was the best teachers do not teach math and reading and science and history. The best teachers always remember that they teach children about math and reading and science and history. But your focus is on the child. But in Common Core, the focus is not on the child. The focus is on the standard. Everything is about meeting the standard. So curriculum changes so that we can meet the standard. All of the pieces of what happens in a school day revolves around meeting the standard. Is that just my opinion? No, there's actually been studies on it. The National Academies Press published a study, what happens when you implement this, and they looked at Texas and Chicago, Tennessee. They looked at about 7 different states, and they looked at a variety of studies. And what they found was that when you implement this system, teachers focus on the quadrants of students who are immediately above that minimum standard and immediately below that minimum standard. They ignore the kids at the very bottom because they'll never make it. So the teachers try to cut their losses to get as many kids as they can. So the studies found that over time, the kids at the very bottom fell farther behind. They ignore the kids at the top because they've already met the standards. So we don't really need to give them instruction. They're already there. Everything focuses on that middle. But over time, that begins to drop because minimum becomes the maximum and everything starts to lower based on it. Again, if we know this, why are we doing this? Let me perhaps explain it. In Pennsylvania, the State Board of Education and the Department of Education actually testified in front of our House Education Committee, and in the long conversation that ensued, part of what they said was, well, we need all of the standards to be the same. For example, if you buy a hamburger at the McDonald's in Erie, which is in the northwest corner of our state, and then you go to Philadelphia, which is in the southeast corner, and buy a hamburger, it's the same hamburger. So why can't the same quality standards apply to all of our children? So let's explore that analogy since it was their analogy. Let's start with the underlying premise. When you go to McDonald's, all the ground meat that they use is the same. If the ground meat doesn't meet that USDA, whatever standard they have, they throw it away. If the ground meat is above that standard, you know, like maybe it's Angus beef or something, well, they throw that away too. They don't use it because they'd have to charge too much for the hamburger. So all the ground meat is identical, and they discard anything that is above or below. All of the equipment in every McDonald's is the same. They're required. The stoves are the same. The kitchen's set up the same. If you go into the back of any McDonald's, they're all the same. They all run at the same temperature. All the spatulas, everything is identical. The recipe is identical. McDonald's actually has a school. I was kind of interested to find out that you have to go and learn how to make a McDonald's hamburger. And you have to this much salt and this much pepper and this much whatever secret ingredients they put in. And it gets cooked at this long, at this temperature, so that all the hamburgers are the same. So you have identical raw materials and identical facilities and identical process, so you get an identical product. That makes sense. Now let's look at our schools. Do children come identically? I've never met 2 children that were the same, even identical twins. I have 2 nieces that are identical twins, and they actually like to go up in the middle of the day and change clothes to see if they can fool you. But if you spend time around them, yeah, you can still tell who's who. And you know, their mom could always tell who was who. And their siblings could always tell who was who, because in fact, they had some differences. So children are not identical. They have different talents and different abilities and different personalities. Schools are not identical. They're rural and urban and rich and poor and old and new. They're not the same. Teachers are not identical. Even if we say they all have equal ability, which they do not, They have different teaching styles. They have different personalities. Think about all the teachers that you knew, and in your head, think about the 3 that were your favorites. If you asked your siblings, who probably went to the same schools that you went to and therefore had the same teachers, to name their 3 favorite teachers, I'll bet at least one of them would be different. Because it's a personality function. How you interact with, sometimes one teacher says it and it's like, I got it. But the person beside you is going, what? Because that teacher didn't say it in a way that connected with the way that child's brain worked. But then the next one does. Teaching is actually a really personal experience between the teacher and the child. So in schools, we have non-identical children in non-identical schools with non-identical teachers. Why would we think we would get identical results? But let's take it one step further. Does anybody here actually think that the hamburger is the client of McDonald's? Does anybody think that what they do to the ground meat is done to the ground meat for the benefit of the hamburger? When did our children move from being the products of the educational, from being the clients of the educational system to becoming its products? And if they're the products, who are the clients? If you look at McDonald's, we do something to a product for a client. Using their own analogy then, Common Core is something we're doing to our children for someone else. That's pretty ugly, isn't it? We talked about the best teachers teach children, not subjects. But Common Core is destroying our best teachers. They're leaving. I was in inner city Philadelphia. I didn't realize I was talking to a room full of public school teachers in the city of Philadelphia, but I was. And afterward, they sort of mobbed me. And they were almost unanimous, saying, as soon as we can quit, we're quitting. Because we will not do this to a child. One woman had tears streaming down her face. She said, my kids cannot, I'm in I have kids who have learning problems. They cannot do this. I am not being allowed to slow down to where they can do it. I am hurting them. I will not do this again. As soon as I can find another job, I'm quitting. And that is happening everywhere. Well, then, who is replacing them? The federal government has a program called Teach for America. You get 5 weeks of training, and then they stick you in a classroom. And if you stay for 2 years, you can get student loans forgiven or tuition paid. In the inner city schools, the teachers who have been there for years and are saying, I won't do this to a child, are being replaced by Teach for America volunteers. 5 weeks of training does not a teacher make. They don't know to do anything but follow the curriculum that the Common Core folks hand them. Now, this is supposed to be about solutions. So let me take just the few minutes I have left and talk a little bit about that. You know, it's interesting. Education in America did used to work. All the way back when America 2000, which you heard about from our Eagle Forum friend, was beginning to be implemented, when the feds were trying to grab control, the federal government commissioned the Atomic Energy Commission, I don't know why they picked them, but that's who they picked, to do a study on the status of education in America. It was called the Sandia Report because it was done by the Sandia Labs. And what that report came back with, all the way back in the late 1980s, was that education in America was not systemically broken. There were pockets of problems, sure. There were things that needed to be dealt with. But systemically, American education actually worked pretty well. That was not the political answer that the Bush, the senior administration, was looking for, so they squelched the report. I did a FOIA request to get it. That cannot be said today. After Goals 2000, America 2000, Goals 2000, No Child Left Behind, by 2010, a national study found that 60% of our kids who go to college need remedial courses. You would think someone would notice. So what did we used to do that now we don't do? What we used to do was have real local control. What we used to do was have not federal micromanagement of what is happening in education. You know, I listened to your quote with the current Secretary of Education, the proper federal role in education. I have news for him. I know what the proper federal role in education is. None. Go home. It's that easy. Education by bureaucrat will never work. Education works when the teacher and the parent, you know, who've actually met the child, make decisions for the child instead of some unseen anonymous bureaucracy. So step number one is get the feds out of the picture because they're breaking something that was not broken in the first place. Step number two, restore actual local control. You know, it's funny, when I debated this in the 90s and my opponents would say, oh, it was just about seat time. I wish it had been. I would have loved to have taken courses in high school where I just had to sit in the chair and get an A. Wow, that would have been my kind of course. But you had to actually pass, you remember. You had to take the test and do the homework and do all the things you were supposed to do. But within that Carnegie credit sort of overview, 3 math, 4 English, 3 history, whatever your state said, how that child got those credits became a local decision. So maybe child A took the highest math that there was. You know, I was the child of an engineer and my dad was all into math, so I wound up taking pretty much everything. But the kid sitting next to me took accounting because that was where they wanted to go. So you had the flexibility at the local level to adapt education for the child. And while there were learning objectives, if a teacher said, you know, this isn't really working for little Johnny, we're going to basically adapt everything you're doing. I was giving a presentation once and a gentleman stood up and said when he was in 5th grade he couldn't read. Slated for failure. And the teacher noticed that he loved birds and he loved flight and everything about it. So basically she took all the textbooks and said, you're not doing any of that. And they spent months talking about birds and she gave him things to read and draw and look at and pictures. And through that, he learned to read. That teacher must have done a pretty good job because the guy told us they went on to the Air Force Academy and retired as a colonel. But he would have failed. He was a failure in 5th grade. And he said, but in this system, that teacher could not have done that because she would have had to check off all the little boxes. She couldn't adapt. When we had real local control, teachers adapted to their children. We used achievement tests. Not these ridiculous assessments. Achievement tests gave us real results. They were not high stakes for children, but you could evaluate a teacher based on it. Because not every child in Mrs. Blankenschmiel's 3rd grade had a bad day on the same day. So as long as the middle was the middle, she was working on grade level. So and children were responsible inside their classrooms. We didn't spend weeks of every year. In Texas, the study said Texas children spent almost 6 weeks a year in testing. That's absurd. That's absurd. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We already know what works. We know that reading in the lower grades and math in the higher grades gets us to college. We also know how to teach our children. The federal government did a project. It was called Project Follow Through. It is the largest federal study in education ever funded anywhere by anyone on the planet. It lasted from 1965 until eventually 1995. They followed several 100,000 children through 180 different learning facilities, and they evaluated 11 different instructional methods. It was called Project Follow Through. It found that direct instruction, where the teacher is the sage on the stage, interacting with the children, teaching them, working with them, outperformed every other model by up to 80 percentage points. And it outperformed them in cognitive abilities, in academic knowledge, and in self-esteem. The kids could actually count and read, and so they felt good about themselves because they could do it. Yet Common Core says the teacher should be the guide on the side, not the sage on the stage. We do know what works. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. The research is pretty overwhelming. All we need to do is free our local districts and teachers to follow it. It's not that hard. It isn't every child the same. It's allow the flexibility within oversight standards to reach every child where that child lives. If I think about Common Core, one time somebody asked me to define it. Common Core changes the definition of education from enlightening a child to reaching a standard. And then it moved control of that standard from parents and teachers and school boards to a centralized, non-elected bureaucracy. That is Common Core in one sentence. So it's an easy question. Do we want our schools to produce our children, quality checked, like widgets, to one preset minimum standards? Or do we want our schools to treat each child as an individual and to challenge that child to reach his or her potential? Those are the choices before us. If you want the former, then Common Core is for you. If you want the latter, then our answer to Common Core has to be a clear and resounding no. The last thing I get asked is, can you win? You know, it's funny, I travel the country and I meet women everywhere. This is women on the wall. And a gentleman once said to me, you know, why is there so many women doing this? And I said, well, you know, it's been said that fathers will die for their children, and God love you, gentlemen, that is true. Mothers will kill. There is no mother and no grandmother anywhere who is ever going to tell the government, yes, you can have this little one. Will never happen. When the U.S. Department of Education and their billionaire friends decided to declare war on the children of America, I have news for them. It's a war they're going to lose. They lost in the 1990s, and they're going to lose today. How long it takes us to win is entirely dependent on what you are willing to do. If you're going to attend a conference and go home, it'll take those of us on the battle lines longer. If you are willing to stand up and be counted, put a Stop Common Core sign in your yard, have a coffee with your neighbors, talk in your church group and your soccer team, and if you're a committee person in your committee, vet candidates. Are you against Common Core? And if the answer is anything other than a resounding no, a resounding opposition to Common Core, they don't get any support. The more active you are, the faster this will go. People say to me, well, you know, it might take 5 years. Well, I hope not. Our kids don't have anybody defending them but us. And they don't get to be 6 years old twice. They only get one go-round. If you want to win this battle, stand up, join in Texas, your women on the wall, join the battle lines, and make sure that everyone knows that America's children and America's future are absolutely not up for sale. Thank you.
Do you want to do a few Q&A? Do you mind doing that? I'm going to do a Q&A. We don't have a lot of time, but I wanted to, I know Dr. Luksik has to leave today, and so if anyone has a question, I wanted you can go up to the microphone in the middle of the room and ask a question. We'll just do 2 or 3 questions, and I'll start off. Because one of the things, the different names, they rebrand a lot. Mm-hmm. I think Mike Huckabee has been caught suggesting that to states. Some of the things I know in Texas, we're strong. We said no to Common Core. We are standing against it. So when we ask our elected officials, are you against Common Core? They all say that they all voted for it, from Wendy Davis to, to Greg Abbott. And so they can all say that, but it comes in different packages. And one of the concerns I know that we have in Texas is that we passed House Bill 5 that is college and career ready, and it took down the standards, if you will. And so I just want people to understand and get your take on the different things that you're seeing from state to state of how they're creating the illusion that they don't have it when in fact we do.
They are, and unfortunately Texas isn't the only one. My own state of Pennsylvania did the same thing. There's a couple things you can do to dispel it. Your state, when you did not apply for Race to the Top money, you did do an ESEA flexibility request. And in your flexibility request, you did an alignment of your state standards with the Common Core standards. And I forget now which is which, but one was more than 90% and one was 70-some% aligned. So you can begin with, well, wait a minute, you told the federal government that you were going to line them up. One of the things when I travel from state to state is I look at what the state tells the feds, and then I look at what the state tells you. They can lie to you. They won't lie to the feds. So if you can look at documents, that's always a helpful thing to pull that together. The second thing you do is take whatever your state standards are and lay them right beside the Common Core standards yourself. In many states, I actually do when I do a state PowerPoint, and actually Pennsylvania's is back there so you can watch it. I take the state standards and I put the Common Core right beside it. And they're word for word the same. And people go, oh, they really? Yeah, you're looking at them. They're word for word. So you can do your own alignment. The Common Core standards are on the Common Core website, and your state standards, your Department of Education has them posted. So you can lay them out yourself and put them right beside each other. The other thing to look at is the curriculums, the books that are being used, do they say Common Core aligned? Because if they do, you're doing Common Core. And then follow how your state assessment had to go to Washington for approval. Every state did. If you're not using Park or Smarter Balance, your state assessment is required to be approved by the feds. There's a chart that tells it, but you should be able to track that through your own department's website. And if you can't, call me because I will for you. What was approved and how was it approved, and the assessment. If I control the assessment at the federal level, I control what happens in your classrooms. And the last thing is what contractor did you use to develop your state test, and is it a Common Core contractor? There's one called Data Recognition Corporation. Pennsylvania, Alaska, Alabama, and several other states use them. All of their stuff is based on Common Core. Well, if you're not teaching it, you can't pass a test based on it. So look at who your testing contractor is to see if they're doing Common Core based assessments. And the Department of Education website should give you that information. Like you should be able to pound through to find it. You may have to dig, but it's almost always there. Right. Does that help?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Very much.
Yes,
Very
ma'am.
much.
Thank you, Dr. Luksik.
You're welcome.
This is not on, evidently. For your enthusiasm, your intelligence, your passion, everything. I read an article about you, and you commented about the definition of the catchphrase that they use, rigor or rigorous. Would you please comment on that?
Yes. It's a marketing phrase, and actually you can track it all the way back into No Child Left Behind. That they never don't say rigor or rigorous. It's how they market the standards. They want it so that when you hear the standards, rigor pops in your head without you thinking about it. For example, if I said, we are farmers, you'd all say, bump, ba-dum, bump, 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 because you've heard it in every commercial. It's a marketing technique. But when you look at the definition of rigor, remember Algebra 1 by the end of high school, or by the end of your sophomore year, you don't even have to actually read the book because we give it to you in auditory format. So it's a marketing word, but it is not an actual construct in how the standards are developed or implemented. Yes, sir.
Thanks for your talk. Early in the what you had to say, you referred to a study which indicated that students who get into Algebra 2 do much better in college, and those who get into calculus do something like 28 times better.
Yes.
By some measurement. Could you tell me again, what study was that?
Yes, the first one was a U.S. Department of Education study in 1999, and it was published in a document called Answers in the Toolkit, or Toolbox. The second one was an Auburn University 2004 meta-analysis. Both studies are in the videos that I have in the back, where I actually put them up on the screen with the actual site. So if you want to do that at the end, you can do that too. But one was the U.S. Department of Education, and the second one was Auburn University 2004.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.
Although Texas has rejected Common Core and Race to the Top's funds, Obama opened it up to individual school districts. We have 24,000 students in Turkish charter schools in Texas. I wrote an article stating that the Turkish charter schools who applied for Race to the Top funds and got them here in Texas are using Common Core in their schools. The superintendent of the charter schools wrote to our organization, Texas Eagle Forum, and our State Board of Education and denied that they are not implementing Common Core standards, that their standards are higher than what they are using in Common Core. And they gave us some gobbledygook language. And can you tell me how we address something like that?
So did they get Race to the Top money?
Yes, they did, $30 million.
And they applied for it?
Yes, they did.
Pull the application. Get the actual application. That's how you'll refute it. Because in order to get Race to the Top money, they got points. Because it was a competition. They got points if they adopted Common Core. So in that Race to the Top grant application, it will tell you whether or not they did it. I'm sure that they did or they wouldn't have gotten the money, but that's where you go. Whenever the state goes to the federal government, either to get money or to get relief from regulations, whatever they put in that document becomes legally binding on both parties. Therefore, it's true. So pull their Race to the Top grant application and see what it says about Common Core, because that was principle number one.
Okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Are both the ACT and the SAT controlled by the Princeton-Pearson cartel?
They're controlled by the College Board legally. The head of that is David Coleman. David Coleman was the chief architect of the Common Core standards. As a little side note, David Coleman tried to get a job in the New York City public school system and they wouldn't hire him. So a man who couldn't get a job teaching is now directing education. He said his first priority was to redesign the SAT to make it Common Core compliant, and that has been done. They've also redesigned the AP American History, the College Board, with a new framework. So the College Board which is a private nonprofit, is moving their tests to be Common Core compliant, which will then have an effect on curriculum across the board.
Is there a way that the states might try to find alternatives to the SAT and the ACT then?
The states don't need to, that's not a state mandated test, but you can find colleges who don't use that as an admission requirement. And there are many, and the number is growing.
And this will be the last question.
Okay.
Hi, I'm from Colorado, and we look at Texas and a lot for direction and what you all did here, but as I have joined Women on the Wall conference calls from there and learned about House Bill 5, we have a lot of concerns. Right there in Colorado, our biggest thing is the testing. We finally did get a bill passed that is developing a task force to slow it down. To me, it's a speed bump, and develop and do an evaluation on the demise of park testing and what is an alternative. And so I was hoping to take back some useful information on the states that did not initially get entrapped with this. What testing are they using? And then you answered the question about how to find, did your state, like Texas, actually get into, what kind of testing are they getting into, what kind of mandates? So that was helpful. But what I'm concerned about is what teachers and superintendents are asking us out there is, what is our alternative for the testing?
Actually, I was in Tennessee a couple of months ago working with them, and the result ultimately was that they pulled out of the park test, and the representative that I was working with, we contacted the Iowa test. Now, the Iowa test has a clean test, and they have a Common Core compliant test, but there's still an achievement test. They give you real information, and while the park test is $29.50 per student, the Iowa test is $9. So it gives you, it's a middle ground. The Iowa does have both. The Stanford test is still, as far as I know, clean, because homeschoolers use the Stanford test for their own evaluations, and that's a big enough audience for them that they haven't revamped the test as of yet. And I'm not sure about the other ones, whether they still have a clean version or not.
Is there a resource site? Because I'm a nurse, not an educator, but I need to have like people like links and sites. And where would I direct a school board, in to look up the different types of testing?
You know, there really isn't, and there's not
No.
a lot of testing experts out there. If you send me a question, I'll answer it for you. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much. You know, when we're talking about local control and taking back our communities and our schools, it's our children. Local control is us. It's our parental right to be educating ourselves and to be standing up for our children. And that's what all of you are doing here today.